Cool. All right. That was like worked. Perfect. Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Amanda, and if you don't know anything about me, I am an Android developer at Atomic Robot, and I, like most people, kind of have taken this dive into Compose, especially since it's really been released into 1.0. I remember when I think it first came out in Google I/O 2019, and fun then, but it's definitely transformed and grown since then. And now I'm even able to use it in some of my client and production apps, which is pretty exciting. So today, I just kind of wanted to explore a little bit with Constraint Layout. It really gave me a chance to kind of check out the changes that have occurred with Constraint Layout in Compose compared to the old view system. I've only gotten little bit, but it's kind of interesting, a little bit of the changes that have happened and things that have stayed the same. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so a little bit about Constraint Layout if you don't know what it is. It was introduced in 2017, and basically it does exactly what its name is. It's constraining its child views to either its parent, like its parent of itself, or to other views. And basically, there was a real push for developers to use Constraint Layout with the old view system because it creates this dynamic view that not only does it render pretty well on multiple screen sizes and types, but it's this flattened hierarchy, which you can kind of see on the left here, compared to, say, using a whole bunch of lists and nesting them inside of one another. You've now created this whole nested hierarchy that's going to cause it to not render as smoothly or as quickly. So that was the biggest push that Google was doing for Constraint Layout. Now, switching over to Compose, what does it look like with Compose? Well, similar to linear layouts, Compose has rows and columns. So you can still actually nest rows and columns as you would linear layouts. Well, the XML version of this nesting, as we just discussed, has performance issues, but is that the same in Compose? The answer is actually no, which is kind of surprising. So I have a couple quotes here as to why. So this one from Jim Sprock: everything is relative or subjective, but in general, heavily nested layouts were a problem with the old view-based widgets, but should not be a problem with Compose. So he's basically saying nest as much as you want. And moving on to the next one, Compose will not have the same nesting problem in general because they're built on nodes. The nodes are cheaper. Layout is forced to be single pass. So obviously, less nesting is going to be faster in general, but you're not going to have the same concerns as we did with the view-based system. And I couldn't quite find this documentation in the Constraint Layout anymore. I think they might have updated it, but Constraint Layout is in the straight up Constraint Layout documentation. It's the recommended way to create large and complex layouts, as a flat hierarchy was better for performance than nested views are. This is not a concern in Compose, which is able to efficiently handle deep layout hierarchies. So straight up in the documentation, they're telling you you don't have to use Constraint Layout in the way that you kind of needed to for the old view system, but it's still something that's available to you. So if we don't need to use it, why would you use it? So again, this is straight from the documentation. You can use it or not. They're not Google is not really directing people one way or the other, but they do make a point of you might want to use it for readability and maintainability. So could be something like this. On the left side, you have that nested layout with Compose, but on the right side is the exact same view in Constraint Layout. So whether or not one side is more readable or maintainable than the other is really up to personal preference. I personally don't have a preference, but I do like kind of the flattened hierarchy on the right side, because then I have less of those brackets moving in. Unless you start using rainbow brackets in Android Studio like I did, that's really helpful. Okay, cool. So we've talked about kind of what constraint layout is, why you would use constraint layout versus rows and columns. But now we're going to check out how to actually build a view. And it's super difficult, very difficult. This is it, constraint layout. And then with anything compose related, you can pass in a modifier. So in this case, we're making a constraint layout as big as it can possibly be given the constraints from the parent. But it's a little more complicated than that, because how are we supposed to now constrain the children views? Well, constraint layout, we're going to have to create some IDs, because just like in the XML layout, you'd be like constrain top to top of, and then pass in an ID or pass in like the parent. So in order to do that, you basically create these variables, and then you just set create refs, which is going to create all of those reference IDs for you. This example, I'm pretty much building, I'm going to continue to use it, but I'm pretty much building a recipe details page. So I've added like a menu button, a recipe image, some title text, the duration, how long it takes to make a recipe. So all of those IDs are contained here. Okay, so the next step is now using those IDs and actually constraining a view. So for the main image, we're going to use this constrain as modifier. So when you constrain as, you actually pass in the ID that you want to use for the view that you're modifying. So in this case, this is the menu icon. So I'm constraining it to my ID menu button. And then inside of the block of that modifier, we're going to add the actual constraints. The menu button, the start of it, we're going to link to the start of the parent, but we're also going to make sure it's 16 dp away from the start of the parent. So adding a little bit of padding in there. And then the top, same thing. We're going to link it to the top of the parent, but also adding in the 16 dp padding. So basically, when you do that, you now have something like this. But you can see that there's now a menu button on the top left of the screen that has that 16 dp padding on the top and on the start. So that's it. It's pretty basic there, but there's some more. There's some more in-depth features that the XML version of Constraint Layout had that they actually continued to bring over to the Compose version. The first one being guidelines. Guidelines are invisible lines that can be added to a view so that you can more easily constrain the children views. You can even add it at like specific screen percentages. So in this case, we create a right guideline that's 40% of the screen from the start of the screen. So from the left side, there's a line, a vertical that's 40% of the visible screen. And then basically, when you go to use that, you use it similar to in your constrain as, but instead of constraining to say the parent top or the parent start, we're going to constrain to the guideline. So here we are creating another image. We are linking the start to the start of the parent. It's going to link up to the left side of the view. We're linking the top to the bottom of our menu button and adding a little bit of padding. And then we're going to make sure that our image only fills up at most 40% of the screen. So we're going to link it to this guideline that we just created. And then something here that I didn't talk about is setting the width. So I'm setting the width to fill to constraint. So it's going to make sure that this image is going to fill as much possible space as it could, but also be within the constraints still. So using a guideline that looks like this. And if you can see some of the light gray lines and arrows, this is actually from the Compose preview in Android Studio. The dotted line that you see is actually the guideline. So it's kind of a cool thing to use if you just hover your mouse over the preview. Next up is something I always forget about, and that's chaining. Specifically here, I'm just talking about horizontal chaining, but you can do the same thing with vertical chains as well. So what chaining is, it's a group of views linked to each other with constraints. And for Compose, there's only 3 chain types. I believe there was 5 with the view system, but they've narrowed it down to 3 with Compose. There's this first one, spread, which is just evenly going to distribute the children views within the area given to it. The second one is spread inside, and that means the first and the last view are going to be fixed at the start and the end of the view given to it, and then everything else inside is going to be evenly distributed. And the last one is packed. So that literally just means all of the children views are smushed together as close as possible and placed in the center of the view. So using that in my recipe details page here, I basically created a horizontal, and I passed in those reference IDs again of image 1 through 4. And then that'll take as many arguments as you want for reference IDs. And then the last parameter is the chain style. And for this specific type, we're using the spread inside. Cool, moving on. So similar to guidelines, you also, what a barrier is going to do is it's going to create, or it's going to take references to multiple views, and then it's going to create a guideline at the most extreme specified size. It might be hard to see up there, but the barrier is being created at the top. It's just creating a bottom barrier. So that's our extreme, or that's our specified side is going to be the bottom. And we want the bottom barrier of the cover image and the tag container. And the tag container is what I just created with the horizontal chain. So that's going to create our invisible guideline. And then I'm going to use that to actually constrain another group of text here. So you can see in my constrain as block, I'm linking the top of this. Yeah, I'm linking the top of this to the barrier created by that image and the tagline. So that basically looks like this, and it's really hard to see on here, but again, this is that preview function, but you can see, similar to how we saw the vertical dotted line before, there's a small horizontal dotted line, so you can see where the barrier is, and that's the most extreme point of those 2 references. So it ends up being the bottom of the image in this instance. So that's pretty much it. Whole lot going on with the constraint layout features. They really kind of slimmed it down from the view, the old view way. I feel like they've kind of consolidated it and made it a little bit easier to understand, in my opinion. But today we've covered basically what constraint layout is, a little bit of its history, why we're going to use it. It's really just personal using it for readability and maintainability and not having as many nested views. We discussed a bit how to create a constraint layout, talked about guidelines, chains, and barriers. But yeah, that's pretty much it. There's a whole bunch of really awesome references on constraint layout, including the official docs. And all those links are here. And that's all I have on constraint layout.